What's going on, guys? My name is Matt and I am back with a new PC build. A few weeks ago, I gave myself the challenge to build a gaming PC for under $200. It was a lot of work, but the price to performance on this system is great and I'm excited to share it with you. I'm also going to be showing you a way to get into PC gaming that's potentially even cheaper than this system, thanks to today's sponsor, Nvidia, and their GeForce Now service, which I'll be talking about later. The system I'm showing off today was a fair bit of work to find all the parts and to put together, but I'm pretty happy with the end result. This PC is using used parts, which is par for the course at this price point, and I did have to do a fair bit of deal hunting. PC parts, like a lot of technology right now, have been in a higher demand than usual, so this added an extra level of difficulty in picking the parts. This video isn't meant to be an exact guide on what parts to get, and is more meant to show you that if you put in the time, effort, and research, you can put together a PC for super cheap. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the parts that are going in this $200 gaming beast. The first part I usually pick out is the CPU. That's because this choice will determine a number of other factors of the build, like the motherboard, cooler, and RAM choice. Generally, I like to try and find hidden gems among used parts because most of the well-known ones aren't always a very good value for the money. I knew I wanted something at least a bit more modern than the old Sandy Bridge based builds myself and others usually do at this price point. Ryzen CPUs were out of the question, so I settled on going with an Intel CPU around the 4000 series. After doing some looking around and deliberating, I ended up picking a Xeon E3 1220 V3. This is a quad-core CPU on Intel's Haswell architecture. This doesn't have hyperthreading and it can turbo up to 3.5 GHz. This is essentially an i5 4670 without the integrated graphics. E3 Xeons from this time could slip in and work with consumer-grade 1150 motherboards. This means there wasn't any weird or expensive server boards needed to be purchased. I got this for $30 on eBay, which is a pretty good deal and is $10 to $20 less than what I would have had to pay for the equivalent i5. I would have preferred to get a chip with hyperthreading, but that was out of the budget and this ended up working out pretty well. Now let's go ahead and talk about the motherboard this CPU is going into. After doing some looking around, I ended up settling on this board from a manufacturer named ECS. This is using the H81 chipset, and while basic, it gets the job done well. This might look like an OEM board you could find in an HP or Dell, but there's nothing proprietary about it. The back panel I/O is a little lackluster, but it did come with an I/O shield and is front panel USB 3. While I would have liked to get something a little nicer, this board had all the features I needed, and for the $25 I paid, this was actually a really good deal. To cool the CPU, I was going to use a basic Intel stock cooler, but I saw it had a backplate pre-installed on the motherboard. This is the type that an OEM cooler would go onto, so I ended up picking up an OEM Dell cooler that was a little more than I would have liked to pay at $12, but it got the job done. This cooler is a very basic aluminum heatsink with a fan attached. There's no copper to be seen, but for our little quad core, it did a good job of keeping things fairly cool and quiet. Moving on to RAM, I would have loved to get 16 GB, but again, at this budget, it just didn't seem possible. For this reason, I went with a 2x4 GB kit of Micron DDR3 memory at 1333 MHz. This was a pretty standard deal at $15 for this kit, but it worked well in this build, and 8 GB is plenty for games like Fortnite and CSGO, which you'll see later in the benchmarks. Our motherboard only has 2 slots, meaning both are filled with this build, but the good thing is that by having our RAM in a 2-stick kit, it means it'll run in dual channel operation, which does help boost performance by a bit. For the graphics card, this was one of the harder items to pick out. GPU prices are considerably higher than they were at the beginning of the year, so I had to do a fair bit of deal hunting to get this card. What I went with is an RX 460, which I picked up for only $55 locally. This is an OEM RX 460 that I believe was used in HP pre-built, and I have actually used the same model of this card in the past. The RX 460 is getting a bit old at this point, but for esports gaming, it still packs a fairly powerful punch. It only has 2 GB of video memory, which will be a detriment in newer games like COD Warzone, but in most situations at 1080p gaming, it should work fine. I would have loved to get something with a bit more power like a GTX 960, but I just couldn't find any good deals on eBay, and this was the best I could find locally. Overall, the RX 460 is still a good card, but it definitely wasn't my first pick. Moving on to storage, I went with what I usually do at these super low price points, which is get a refurbished 500 GB 7200 RPM drive off of eBay. If you do this, definitely check the disk health when you get it and try and keep important files backed up on something like a flash drive. 500 gigabytes is more than enough for the OS, applications, and a number of games, and yes, even COD Warzone fits. I think this is a good starting point, but upgrading to an SSD in the future would be a good idea. You could at that point have your OS and applications on the SSD and just use the 500 gigabyte drive as a games drive. Now let's talk about the power supply. Power supplies are the hardest hit price-wise right now for whatever reason. Many new and used units are going for upwards of double of what you could get them for just 6 months ago. This was definitely a big hindrance and meant I had to do a fair bit of hunting. What I ended up getting was an Antec 380 watt unit off of eBay for only $20 with free shipping. This was a pretty good deal in my opinion, and it's worked out well thus far. 380 watts is more than enough for the system I'm running it on, and it even has a 6-pin PCIe cable, meaning upgrading to a better GPU isn't out of the question. This is 80 plus bronze, which is great to see, and it's from a reputable manufacturer, so I have no problems whatsoever using it, even if it did come in super dusty. It does have ketchup and mustard cables, but honestly, that's not a big deal and really doesn't matter at all because of the case I went with. Speaking about the case, what I went with is one of the cheapest enclosures I could find, which is the DIY PC Solo T2R. This is an ATX case which makes the M-ATX motherboard and small graphics card look even tinier than they are, but for a little over $30 it really isn't a bad deal at all. It comes included with both an intake and exhaust fan, and the airflow design isn't bad on this case. There's no side panel window and it looks like it's straight out of 2008, but looks aside, it more than got the job done. Building this PC went pretty smooth, and the big case meant doing stuff like plugging in front I/O was a breeze. I didn't put too much time into cable management just because no one will ever see the inside of this system unless they watch this video. All in all, for $200, I think I did a pretty good job with this build. So before we go ahead and talk about this PC's performance, I want to take a minute and talk about a way you can get into PC gaming for potentially even less than the cost of this PC. This is thanks to today's sponsor Nvidia and their cloud gaming service GeForce Now. For those who don't know what cloud gaming is, it's essentially a way for you to play even the latest and most hard to run games on the worst of computers. This is possible because a server is rendering the game while your PC is just streaming it to your screen. One thing that's great about GeForce Now as a cloud gaming service is anyone can try it for free with no commitment of any kind. This means that if you have a laptop or old PC laying around, then you can give it a try with zero financial investment whatsoever. What's even cooler is now there's an option to run GeForce Now on Chromebooks without having to download anything at all. For example, here's me using GeForce Now through this super cheap Chromebook. Now, because you are streaming the gameplay, having a good internet connection is going to be important to get the best possible experience. Otherwise, there may be too much latency for it to be enjoyable. Again, the great thing is, if you're unsure of whether or not your internet is good enough, then you can head to the link in the description and try it out for free. With the free membership, you're limited to 1-hour play sessions, which you can reconnect to a new session as soon as the old one is over. But if you do find that it works well for you, you may want to consider upgrading to a Founders membership. This gives you priority access to servers, extended play sessions, and the ability to increase visual fidelity, with the big benefit being able to play with RTX on. GeForce Now supports hundreds of instantly playable games, including the biggest free-to-play titles, and 1,000 plus games through single session installs. It also lets you play the games you already own from top digital stores, which include Steam, Uplay, and Epic. You can also play on nearly any PC, Mac, TV with a Shield connected, Android mobile device, and supported Google Chromebooks. I found I had the best experience when playing with the desktop app using a wired internet connection, but even using the Chromebook, I was able to get a playable experience in a lot of games. I can see this being a great service for those of you out there wanting to play a difficult to run game, but who don't have the PC horsepower to play it. With all this being said, if you already have a computer of some sort and are wanting to get into PC gaming, this is a great option. Again, there's a free membership version, so if you're on the fence about it, I would highly recommend you at least try it out. To access this service and support the channel, click the link in the description and you'll quickly be given the ability to PC game even on an old and slow computer. Thanks again to Nvidia for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the performance of the PC. So I went ahead and tested this $200 system against a few different popular games to see how well it performs, and honestly it performs well, but I was hoping for a bit more. Let's start things off with Fortnite. I tested Fortnite in a Team Rumbles match at 1080p Pro settings, which is epic view distance with pretty much everything else set to low. With these settings, the system averaged in the mid-90s, which was a smooth experience, and I felt like most people could play competitively with this performance. 144 FPS would have been nice, but realistically, if you're using a $200 PC, you're probably playing on a 60Hz display. Next, let's move on to CSGO, which I tested at 1080p Pro settings, which is most things set to low. I played a match on Dust 2, and with these settings, the system averaged in the upper 100s. Sorry, the MSI Afterburn stats aren't showing up for this, not sure what happened. Next, let's talk about Valorant, which I tested at 1080p high settings. With these settings, Valorant received an average also in the upper 100s, which was a very smooth and enjoyable experience. Moving up to more difficult to run games is where I started to run into trouble with the system. For example, COD Warzone kept crashing on me and it was very difficult to actually get into the game. I also tested Far Cry 5, which at 1080p low settings provides an average in the mid-30s. This is playable but definitely not ideal. If you're wanting to play these AAA games on a system like this, then again, using GeForce Now is a good option. You can play your esports games like Valorant natively and harder to run games with GeForce Now. For example, Far Cry 5, which the system couldn't run well at low settings, is a game that you can crank the settings up and get a smoother experience by using GeForce Now. Overall, the system performs pretty well in popular esports games, but trying harder to run AAA games is not a good idea. With this being said, I think this system offers a good value for its cost, especially when you take into account the current state of the used market. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. Again, thanks to Nvidia for sponsoring this video. To give GeForce Now a try, click the first link in the description. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.